Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try out a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With the launch of their managed Kubernetes platform, it's easy to get started with the next generation of deployment and scaling, powered by the battle-tested Linode platform, including simple pricing, node balancers, 40 gigabit networking, dedicated CPU and GPU instances, and worldwide data centers. Go to pythonpodcast.com/Linode today, that's Linode, and get a $60 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. You listen to this show to learn and stay up to date with the ways that Python is being used, including the latest in machine learning and data analysis. For more opportunities to stay up to date, gain new skills, and learn from your peers, there are a growing number of virtual events that you can attend from the comfort and safety of your own home. Go to pythonpodcast.com/conferences to check out the upcoming events being offered by our partners and get registered today. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing the FLUFL Barry Warsaw about his role in the Python community, past, present, and future. So, Barry, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hello, everybody. I'm Barry Warsaw. I've been a core developer since 1994. So I've been involved in Python for quite a long time. Currently serve on the Python Steering Council, my second term, and I work at LinkedIn.
Looking at the acronym for Steering Council, we're one letter off from the Python Secret Underground, which emphatically does not exist.
Exactly. I'll just point out that, Python, of course, is named after Monty Python. So humor has always been, an integral part of the Python community.
Absolutely. So you shared this story a little bit in the interview that you were on a few years ago now, talking about the overall Python enhancement proposal process. But for anybody who hasn't listened to that, can you just give a bit of the background of how you got introduced to Python?
Sure. So actually, it was interesting because I don't know how many people remember Usenet, but Usenet was a big thing. It was like a kind of a bulletin board forum system that people used, and Compline Python showed up one time, and I was kind of into programming languages, so I checked it out, and it was nothing but Monty Python jokes. So I thought, well, this is great, but what is it doing in Complang, right? What does it have to do with, programming languages? So I kind of set it aside, and then a few months later, some friends of mine at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which I had worked at, up until about 1990, sent me an email and said, hey, we've got this guy coming over and he's going to give a 3-day workshop. And would you like to attend? And it was, local to where I was living. So I had just started at the Corporation for National Research Initiatives. And so myself and one of my colleagues went up and we attended the first Python workshop in November of 1994. And I got to meet Guido and I got to see how the language was being developed. And I just kind of fell in love with both. I mean, Python, the language, I had sort of dabbled in it before the workshop and gotten some initial impressions and really loved the language. And once I met Guido, he's still a very close friend of mine. I think he's just a fantastic person and technologist. And I think he's been an amazing leader for the language. So I just fell in love with it. And we ended up using it at CNRI. And we, over the next few months, we hired Guido and he moved to the States, and I worked with him, within throwing distance, in the next cube for about 8 years before he moved out to California. And then 3 years ago, I followed him out here. So,
And as somebody who has been involved with the language for so long, what are your senses of how much of the core elements have stayed true all the way throughout, and how much has it really changed in terms of its character or capacity in that time?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Last year, I gave a talk at the local Bay Piggies, which is, the Silicon Valley Bay Area Python interest group. And I went through and pulled down the tar balls for all the Python versions going back to 0.93. Grabbed all those, looked at the change logs. I couldn't compile any of them on any modern system without significant amount of work. None of them built. None of the early Python zeros or Python ones built. But I went through and looked at the change log and kind of got a sense of what remembering what the language was like in the early days. And a modern Python developer would look at Python 1.1 and say, it looks very familiar. It has not radically changed. In some ways, it has exactly the same feel that, I fell in love with 25 years ago. But in a lot of ways, it's changed immensely. For example, there was one release early on where Guido just, within one release changed the equality operator. It used to be that assignment and equality were both a single equal sign. And in one release, Guido just said, I'm changing it to double equals. And there was no consideration of backwards compatibility. There was no problem with people just having to change their code. So a lot of these little things got introduced early on, and the language was changing very quickly. And now it still evolves, but much more slowly. And you see things crop up like keyword arguments. Everybody sort of thinks keyword arguments are a standard part of Python. But there was a time before keyword arguments were a part of the language. And you can see the sort of revolution in the way people think about it. I remember one of the biggest impetuses for that was TickleTK, trying to do graphics with Python. And the tickle bindings, you had to specify every single argument, and it just got completely unwieldy. And then once keyword arguments were added, all the calls got much simpler. And you can just see how that one little feature has changed the flavor, the feel of Python immensely. And it's something that somebody coming into the language today wouldn't even think about.
Yeah, I can definitely see how that would be a pretty revolutionary change, where all of a sudden you can have sane defaults for all of your functions while still allowing for all of the expressivity that you really want, which is one of the more useful aspects of the keyword arguments. But not having them and having to specify every single argument every single time would lead to a lot of boilerplate to be able to wrap the function calls in the sane defaults so that you have some way of not having to rewrite them every single time.
Exactly right. And there's just so many of those little things. And, looking back at Python now, you can see how Guido's sense of aesthetics for programming has really served, both him and the language and the community really well. He just seems to get right at the heart of the matter. And a great example in modern days, I think, is PEP 572, which is the walrus operator. And when the first draft of that PEP came out, I was really against it. I was like, this is wrong for the language. We don't need it, and the semantics are tricky. But I really had faith in Guido, because he really listened carefully to a lot of the comments and feedback that was coming back. Some of it not entirely kind, which is very unfortunate. But what ended up coming out, I actually turned the page, and I'm a big 572 fan. I'm a big walrus operator fan now. So, you see this sense of trying to do the right thing and find the right balance between power, expressivity, and Pythonicness, which is a very sort of amorphous quality to wrap your hands around, but it's still happening today. And so, I have a lot of faith that the language is still a coherent, friendly, fun language to use.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting seeing the evolutions. I've only been using it since around the 2.4 time range, which has still been enough of a change in terms of the capabilities, particularly with Python 3 adding in a bunch of new library capabilities and adding in a lot of the default numeric operations that people are using it for these days. And I'm on board with you in terms of the walrus operator. I've used it in some of my code recently and definitely appreciate being able to have that assignment expression in line with the conditional. Yeah. So it's interesting seeing some of the battles that are won and lost in the PEPs and sort of how that plays out.
Yeah, at one point I was kind of proud of this. I had the most rejected PEPs of anybody. So, I think you got to just, you put these ideas out, and sometimes, and in fact, I've had PEPs that have been retroactively accepted, believe it or not. So, yeah.
Well, definitely lessons to be learned in failure.
Yeah, for sure.
In line with the work that you've done with the PEPs, for people who aren't familiar with you and your overall involvement in the Python language and community, can you just give a bit of a characterization of your role in how you have worked with the language and for the language and the overall community and ecosystem that has grown up around it?
Yeah, it's hard to sort of succinctly summarize 25 years, but I did early stuff with I'm sure nobody remembers anymore, something called the grand renaming, but anybody who's played with the C API for Python, it looks very nice. It's all logical for the most part, a couple of warts here and there, but the naming scheme makes sense. It's easy to find all the documentation. It wasn't the case early on. And one of the very first projects that I worked on when Guido had moved to the States was what we called the grand renaming. And that was taking all the C API stuff and putting all the pi, string this underscore this and that's and pi xe this and that's in front of all the public names. Because at the time, you couldn't embed Python in other C programs. And you couldn't really extend it very well because there were lots of name clashes that were just sort of global C namespace stuff. And we made all that better, with a lot of direction from Guido, of course, but myself and a few of the other early CNRIers did that. So I've dabbled in the C code. I've dabbled in the library. I've dabbled in the build system. I've been a release manager for several releases. I kind of came up with the whole idea of PEPs, and I named the PEPs. And I really feel like the PEP process is something that I'm particularly proud of because I think it's really given us a way to evolve the language. And we could talk about that. But I've really dabbled in a lot of things. I would say that these days I don't do as much programming on Python as I had in the past. I just sort of see my role as kind of changing. And of course, my interests are changing as well. But I've really dabbled in quite a bit of the code.
Yeah, I'll definitely second your notion that the PEPs have been integral to the overall evolution of the language. And it's something that a lot of different languages and development communities and library communities are leaning on, of this notion of a public sort of RFC process. And a lot of the acronyms mirror the PEPs as far as the overall idea of enhancement proposals. And so I think that that's definitely been a great reference point for other languages and communities who want to be very deliberate about the way that they work on the capabilities and functionalities and the ways that you use the technologies that they're building.
I think you're absolutely right. And the PEPs kind of came out of our experience at CNRI because they were running the ITF meetings. And so we saw firsthand the RFC process for internet standards. But we wanted something that was much more lightweight and that was just enough bureaucracy to capture what we needed it to capture. And so that was really the origin of the PEPs, although the acronym PEP was definitely a backronym. I just thought, it was kind of a funny, peppy word, a happy word. And then I filled in the backronym afterwards. But yeah, that's been wildly successful. I've been, at one time I was heavily involved in the Debian community, and they used Debian enhancement proposals. So it's been very cool to see that happen.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the Python community, because of its origin in humor, has a lot of inside jokes and Easter eggs, and the PEPs are no exception there, where you have PEP 401, where you were declared the FLUFL accidentally when you were trying to nominate Tim Peters for the role.
Yep, exactly.
And PEP 801, which was reserved for some enigmatic reason that nobody quite understands.
Yes, excellent. And there's also, we have PEP 666, I think, and there's another funny one, I think. Of course, 401. But yeah, that was kind of, I was one of the PEP editors. So at one point before we moved to GitHub, we had to sort of dole out the numbers, and I was able to sort of reserve a few fun numbers. So
do you have any good plans in place for number 801?
I don't, but there was a band in the 70s called 801. And that's kind of why I'm reserving it, just because maybe something fun will come up at some point.
Maybe you can auction it off at one of the Pie Ladies events.
There you go. That's a great idea.
And so, in terms of outside of the language and your engagement with the community and some of the ways that you have worked to help promote the language and promote its use, what are some of the other ways that you've contributed in that regard, and some of the contributions that you're most proud of, either technical or otherwise?
Well, that's interesting. I've said this before. This is a story I've told quite often, which is that at that first workshop, there were 20 of us in a little room in a government research facility in Gaithersburg, Maryland. And a number of the people who were there came out and said, you cannot tell anybody that I'm here because Python is a competitive advantage. And we don't want our competitors to know that we use Python. Fast forward now, and Python is everywhere. And it was something where I really believed in Python quite strongly right from the get-go. I'd been a fan of programming languages. I've used dozens and dozens of languages in my career, and I still continue to learn new languages. And I love that. But there's something special about Python. And I really noticed that right on. And I really tried in every job that I was at or every side hacking project to promote Python and really say, Python is the right solution for this. And I think a number of us in those early days really believed very strongly in Python and just pushed it into every nook and cranny that we could get away with. And you see that now. Python is arguably within the top 3, if not the second most popular language. The domains in which Python is relevant are so vast and broad that I think that's a function of us really pushing Python, not just me, of course. I mean, everybody who is a fan of Python, pushing Python into new and better and more interesting and challenging domains. So you see like Python growing up into the number 1 language in data sciences, which nobody could have even thought about back then. So yeah, Python's not appropriate for everything, but it is appropriate for so much that just being an advocate for it and pushing for it and proving, that's the other thing, is really building systems and proving that Python can build small scripts, can build libraries, can build applications, can build websites, can build Instagram, for example. Python is so versatile and so easy to get into. And I think that is just something that we've always been promoting and pushing. And that I'm particularly happy about. So
yeah, one of my favorite ways to encapsulate that is, I've heard it a few times, that Python is not the best language at anything, but it's always the second best language at everything.
Yep. Although I'll argue it's the best language for a lot of stuff.
Yes, absolutely. And so looking back at the past 25 years of your involvement with Python, what are some of the things that in retrospect have been the most interesting or surprising or exciting, and some of the turning points in both the success of the language and in your own career and involvement with it? I
think the thing that never ceases to surprise me is being up on stage. Now, hopefully we can do this again after we get a handle on the whole coronavirus thing, but being up on stage and looking out at 3,000 Python fans, and those are only the people, like a sellout crowd at PyCon. And that just blows me away every single time I look out into that crowd. And it's not just, sort of grizzled old veterans like myself. A lot of young people are coming into the language, and very diverse, communities of Python fans. That just, I always believed in the language, but I guess in your heart of hearts, you sort of think there's lots of competition in programming languages. Why should Python win, And yet, in a large way, it sort of has, it is so pervasive in industry and in education. And that, to me, has just been completely surprising, I guess, and very exciting. And I think Python's got a very bright future. It's not going anywhere. And I think as more young developers come in, and I've really been encouraged to see, a lot of younger developers come in and also fall in love with Python and then take an active role in evolving the language and the implementation. And that, to me, that's a sign of health.
Yeah, I definitely think that its utility as a learning language is really helping in bringing in that new generation of programmers. And I'm trying to do my part with teaching my children as well. But it's interesting, too, to see how the overall focus of the community has changed and grown since the early days, where, as you said, it started with a room full of 20 people in a government building. And now it's, multiple conferences worldwide, meetup groups, online forums, everything that you can possibly imagine direction in terms of communication and community. So what are some of the main areas of focus that you have seen in the community as it grows? And what are some of the areas that you think need greater attention or support?
I guess there's two ways to look at it, sort of like from the technology side and then from the community side. From a technology side, one of the things I think Python has done really well is it's sort of been a kind of a chameleon language. So what I mean by that is, in the early days, people were writing scripts to do system administration or little applications and tools and things like that to solve their problems of the day. And as the web got very big, you saw things like Python adapt and grow into various web technologies, both crawling the web and providing, back in the day, CGI bin scripts and building sort of the back end of the web and adapting to the web as that's come up. And, now its role is hugely important in the data sciences. So I think as technology changes, Python is able in large part to adapt to that. And who knows what the next big thing is going to be, but I suspect that Python will be one of the first languages that embraces whatever that next big thing is. I do think Python has some technological challenges that as part of the steering council, I hope that we can find ways to address. For example, Python, I think, needs to be much better at multi-core, and I would love to see Python in the browser, like support, a WebAssembly backend or something like that. So I think there are technological challenges for Python as computing changes. I mean, the state of computers today is so different from 25 years ago. And you can't even imagine what it's going to be like in the next 25 years or the next 5 years. But I have faith that Python, the language, as opposed to necessarily CPython, the reference implementation or the most popular implementation, will adapt to those changing computing environments and new domains. So that's sort of the technology side of things. And there are people working on all that stuff. So I have a lot of confidence that those important domains Python will adapt better to. On the community side, I think we have a lot of good structures in place, a lot of good institutions in place. I think the PSF, for example, has been a fantastic development for Python, and the sense that the community embraces everybody, right? Like, it doesn't matter. You don't even have to be a C programmer, for example, to become a core developer. You don't even necessarily have to work on the standard library to become a core developer. There is so much to do that people can contribute and make Python better. And documentation, build systems, CI/CD, there's just so many things. Education, building the community, bringing in more, widening the diversity circle and bringing in more people from underrepresented communities into Python. Those are all really important things. And I know that, I certainly support all those things. And everybody that I know of in leadership positions in the Python community support that as well. I mean, that's where I'm a big believer in diversity as our strength, and that's along so many different dimensions. But that's what, those new experiences and that enthusiasm is what really keeps Python going. So, we have challenges in the community and we're trying to address them. And I think anytime you have a programming language or a community that's as large and as diverse as we are, you're going to have challenges to, in any large society of human beings. That's a natural effect. But, we really want to make this a welcoming, friendly, happy programming language and development community.
And to your point about the size, when do you think Pythonia is going to become a sovereign nation?
Well, I'm hoping the PSF buys sea land and then we can just all move there. But
And so you alluded to your membership in the Python Steering Council, and that is definitely one of the biggest shifts in recent memory for the language, with Guido stepping down as the benevolent dictator and deferring to this new community structure earlier that there was some period where there was no firm idea as to what that meant for the future of the language. Thankfully, it has become settled, and we've come to what I think is a very good solution to that problem. And so in your role on the steering council, what are some of the main areas that you're personally engaged with and focusing on?
I think, I took very seriously my first term, which I think the main thing that we had to do, even though we had had this community vote and we came up with the current governance system, there was a lot of things that were sort of still kind of left up to the steering council to decide, what the process was for various things. And those things still come up. We still are sort of we're not quite sure what the right process is for X, Y, or Z. But I felt it was a responsibility of mine, as it was in the early days of Python, to get the processes and mechanisms for functional governance in place, that could sustain. I mean, I'm not going to be on the steering council forever. And, there's going to be lots and lots of people serving on the steering council. And I feel like we've gotten it to a really good place where it's a important, stable, functioning institution for deciding how the language is going to evolve. And I took that responsibility pretty seriously in my first term. And we also had a lot of just housekeeping to do, because after Guido had stepped down, there was a long period of time where lots of PEPs needed to be decided on. And we just had to sort of slog through those and figure out, are we going to delegate responsibility for accepting this one, or are we going to keep this one in our wheelhouse? And we just had to get through all those PEPs. In this second term, I think we're in a pretty good steady state with things. And so now we're really talking about things like, what's the future of Python? For example, if we had a pot of money that we could go out and hire some developers, what would we want them to do? Would it be more important to help triage bugs and keep the PRs moving? Or would it be more important to do some venture experimentation, like a WebAssembly backend, or more playing around with multi-core support, trying to get rid of the GIL and things like that? So I think those are some of the things that I feel very strongly we want to be involved in helping not decide what the future of Python is, but helping the community as a whole figure out the future direction for the big ticket items in Python and how we're going to fund them, what the structure for that is going to be. How would you still value and balance the contributions of volunteers, understanding that volunteers have a very difficult time implementing and bringing to fruition some of these really big changes, right? Those are some of the issues that we're dealing with as well.
And for some of those far-reaching and impactful areas of improvement for the language, Russell Keith McGee did an excellent keynote at the last PyCon, which I'll link to in the show notes, and we did a follow-up conversation on that. And to your point of funding, I know that that's a conversation that is ongoing, but at the last PyCon, I saw a few different ideas in terms of how to pursue that and some of the existing challenges in terms of how the organizational structure of the PSF limits in some ways corporate donations, and just some of the overall ideas about how to bring in more money to allow for those more far-reaching and forward-looking projects. And I'm wondering what your overall thoughts are on that, or any of the current developments or current efforts that are going on to help ensure that those projects are able to happen and be sustainable.
One thing that I'm especially happy about is the way the steering council as the technical leaders and the PSF as the community leaders work together. So, I feel very strongly that those divisions of expertise and responsibility are important for Python, because nurturing the community is not necessarily a technical side of things. And while there's lots of community in the steering council that we think about, we're really sort of focused on the technical side of Python's evolution. But the two organizations work really well together. So we talk to the PSF on a regular basis. In fact, Eva attends our steering council meetings, and that's been fantastic. I cannot speak highly enough of Eva. She's absolutely fantastic. So, they look to us to sort of, what are the technical directions that we want to pursue? And then the PSF kind of thinks about, how can we build the structure and the organization to make that happen? And so those are ongoing talks that we have all the time about how to do the things that we want to do that we think that it's difficult for the volunteer community to do, but not devaluing or taking away any of the fun and responsibility and focus that the volunteers bring to Python. It's ongoing discussions about how all that stuff works, and nothing that we're doing, we try to communicate to the community when we have something that's of value to communicate. And the community's input is absolutely important. It's vital. Python has always evolved from a sort of more grassroots movement. If you, like Guido has said this before, there are a few initiatives where he said we should do it this way or this way. It's a lot of it has been things that percolate up from the community, and then Guido finds the right way to make that happen. To put that together. So I don't feel like the steering council's role is to come up with great ideas. It's more to look at the ideas that are coming up from the community and from the grassroots, and that people are challenged with or thinking about, and trying to decide what the focus is. What the right focuses are.
This portion of podcast.init is brought to you by Datadog. Do you have an app in production that is slower than you like? Is its performance all over the place, sometimes fast and sometimes slow? Do you know why? With Datadog, you will. You can troubleshoot your app's performance with Datadog's end-to-end tracing, and in one click, correlate those Python traces with related logs and metrics. Use their detailed flame graphs to identify bottlenecks and latency in that app of yours. Start tracking the performance of your apps with a free trial at pythonpodcast.com/Datadog. If you sign up for a trial and install the agent, Datadog will send you a free t-shirt to keep you comfortable while you keep track of your apps. And so moving now into your professional engagement with Python, as you mentioned, you worked very closely with the Debian community for a number of years and were with Canonical for quite a while. Currently, you work at LinkedIn as part of their Python tools team and helping to facilitate the use of Python at that company. And so I'm wondering what you have seen as being the main use cases for Python, both at LinkedIn and Canonical, and just some of the challenges that crop up at some of these larger organizations or more distributed communities.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So I think, within Debian and Ubuntu, Python is used all over the place. Launchpad was our big code hosting and Ubuntu development portal. That's all Python, or at least it was until, while I was there. At LinkedIn, we use a ton of Python, mostly in the back end, in the tools and foundation areas. So if you walk up to linkedin.com on your browser, or, the iOS devices or the Android devices, a lot of that's going to be, mobile technologies. You're going to be talking to Java backends, but tons and tons of stuff on the internal operational side of LinkedIn is written in Python. And it's just a great language. I mean, you look at like Instagram or so many other big companies, one of the reasons why Python is so pervasive, I think, is because it's very easy to bring a diverse experience of developers. So almost any team is going to have, senior people and more junior people. You're going to have lots of churn, right? So you're going to have new people coming into a code base and you want to get them ramped up to speed quickly. And Python just ticks all those boxes. It just really makes it easy to maintain relatively. And so I think that's why you've seen, certainly why LinkedIn, for example, has adopted Python so pervasively. We have some fairly big systems on the internal side that are built in Python. And I think we're pretty happy about that. Java, of course, is the other big language that we use. Lots of command line scripts and libraries and tools are written in Python. So Python's a pretty important language at LinkedIn. And I think that's true in a lot of big organizations. Surprisingly, one of the developments that I think makes that feasible is type annotations. And I've been that's another feature that I was really against when it got added, because I didn't want Python to turn into Java. And there was a sprint at Instagram, I think, or Facebook. I don't remember exactly the details, a couple of years ago. And, the MyPy team had come to us and said, the reason why we're investing so heavily in MyPy and type annotations is because we can bring in a new junior programmer into a team, and those type hints make it so that they can be productive much more quickly. And so in my own code, I started to say, well, let's adopt type hinting and see what it does to the code base. And it just is, again, it's just the right mix of not too much bureaucracy, but just enough to make it so much more productive. It's just the right balance, you know? And so like now, even in my own code, I'm going through some of my open source libraries and I'm type annotating everything, and I'm feeling great about it, adding MyPy checkers, and it just gives you a better sense of confidence and self-documentation. So that's another feature that I was against, and now I'm totally on board with, So those kinds of things really make it much more palatable in a corporate environment.
Yeah, I've had the opportunity recently to start a couple of greenfield projects in Python and have been using the type hints and annotations, which I hadn't previously really had much experience with. And I'm completely on board with you and the rest of the community that they make everything much easier to reason about, where you can be working in one module and have intelligent auto completion as to what it is that you need to have in there, and some error checks to keep yourself from doing something stupid without having to flip back and forth between 15 different files to make sure that you have all of the arguments correct.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great feature,
Yeah, and in terms of some of the Python projects coming out of LinkedIn, there are a couple I saw a while ago where it's being used for managing your on-call rotations and alerting, which is absolutely mission critical. And so the fact that LinkedIn is trusting Python with that definitely is a huge vote of confidence.
Yeah. And one of our engineers, we at LinkedIn, all of our command line tools, or many of our command line tools, are written in Python. And so we wanted to have sort of a single file executable format. And we had adopted PEX. I don't know if people are familiar with PEX, but it basically is a way to build a zip file, an executable zip file. But we found that there was a lot of problems with the PEX format mostly because it had been around a long time and it had a lot of backwards compatibility hacks that affected performance and things like that. And so one of our engineers built and from the start open sourced a tool called Shiv, which is just all modernized. It's the same basic idea, but much more modernized. It adopts only Python 3. It has all the modern conveniences of Python 3, and it's a great tool. So we've completely shifted to using that. But that was one of the things that we were like, we should open source this and get, give it to the community and engage with them. And that's been super successful. So LinkedIn is pretty open source friendly.
Yeah, Shiv is another tool that's on my list of things to try out for these projects that I'm working on now to simplify the distribution of the projects. Another interesting one that I'm keeping an eye on is PyOxidizer for being able to build standalone binaries.
I'm a big fan of PyOxidizer. I ran an experiment last year to try to convert to using PyOxidizer, and I ran into some problems. Some of them were related to LinkedIn's own weirdnesses, because every corporation has its own weirdnesses. And some of them were things that I would have wanted to adopt or change in PyOxidizer. But it's a really cool project, and I really like Rust, and I like that melding of Rust and Python quite a bit. So I'm hoping that PyOxidizer, is something that, evolves and can, solve LinkedIn's use cases, for example.
And what are some of the other projects or categories of work that you're doing to help support the other engineers at LinkedIn in their use of Python, and just some of the interesting challenges that you're tackling there?
So one of the things that I'm on, my latest kick really is on things like getting widespread adoption of like QA tools is sort of how I'm putting that together. So these are things like Flake 8 for doing static analysis, and the specific set of Flake 8 rules that we want to adopt. Adopting things like isort and MyPy, pervasively within our code bases. I would say Black is kind of a controversial tool, which we haven't quite adopted yet. I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but we have some discussions about Black, but that's along the same lines. So I think a lot of these tools are really important. And then on top of that, adopting standard documentation tools. So like, for example, Sphinx for and we have an internal read the docs implementation. So we want to be able to have all of our documentation easily available, both API documentation and then, prose, usage, examples, tutorials, and things like that. I've recently started playing with Sybil, which is an outgrowth of Manuel, and it's the doc test. I'm a big fan of doc tests, and I've been adopting that. I've been using doc tests for a long time, but like PyTest in my own open source stuff, I had been using Nose too, but I think PyTest, clearly has won the day, and it's a great system. So finding ways to integrate doc tests into the testing stuff. So that's really where I'm sort of focusing my attentions on inside LinkedIn these days is what's the right set of tools that we can deploy and get adopted in a widespread way so that we just have greater confidence and discoverability and documentation for all of our internal Python code bases.
Yeah, those are definitely important endeavors, and it's remarkable the amount of impact that they can have on the overall productivity of a group of developers by just adopting those standards and saying, here's your boilerplate, here's all the configuration, here are the tools that are going to provide guardrails to you so that you can just focus on writing the things that we actually care about and everything else is taken care of.
Exactly. That's exactly right. It just gives everybody greater confidence about all the code. Like coverage is a great example, right? The tools that I am responsible for within LinkedIn, I try to get them to 100% code coverage, and I try to fail the builds if they don't, if they fall below that. Now, 100% code coverage doesn't mean you're not going to have any bugs, but it just increases the confidence level that you have in that code base. So that's another important tool in the toolbox, I guess.
Yeah, it helps prevent projects from descending into legacy, where it's the big ball of mud paradigm, where you have to keep it running because it's critical to so many things, but nobody knows how it works and nobody wants to touch it because they're afraid that it's going to fall over and break.
Exactly. And it's especially, for us, we got rid of Python 2 August of last year. So we took about a year to convert all of our Python 2 stuff to Python 3 and stop allowing Python 2 to build. So it took us about a year, maybe 6 months of planning and 6 months of execution, which really wasn't that bad. But that kind of like code coverage, those numbers, when you're converting to Python 3, are critical, right? Because if you don't know what you're actually testing, you don't know if that change is going to break something or not, especially in a big migration like that. So I'm a big proponent of boosting your coverage and just being able to know what your coverage is, right? Like if I walk up to a random code base and I say, how much of your code is covered by your tests? A lot of code bases don't even know because they don't collect that information. And I think you have to at least know so that you can then ratchet that up and put and invest in your own. You're investing in your own future, right? So
absolutely. What's the adage that write your code as if somebody in the future is going to read it who is a sociopath and knows where you live?
Right. I always say be kind to your future self.
Exactly.
Like I've looked at enough of my code that I've written, years prior in whatever language, and I've said, "Oh, this is terrible." What was I thinking back then? So be kind to your future self.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we've all had that experience of looking back at their projects and saying, "I don't understand why I did it that way because that makes absolutely no sense."
Well.
Or how did this ever work?
You're so right, and that is another thing that I try to promote is like, how do you comment code, right? Like, I don't need you to say, "Oh, I'm adding one, to this value over here." When I'm reading code, I want to know, why did you pick this algorithm as opposed to that algorithm, right? I'll go through that code and I'll say, well, I thought about doing it this way, and I tried to do it that way, and that was worse performance and blah, blah, blah. And I'll put that in a comment so that when somebody comes by in a couple of years, whether that's me or somebody else, and they'll say, now, why did they do it that way and not A, B, or C? That comment will explain, the thought process to come up with that particular approach or that particular algorithm. And that's an educational role. The proper way to do comments, the proper way to do documentation.
Yeah, all important things for software. It's not just about making the bits fly about. It's making sure that the humans who read it are able to figure out why they're being flown about in the first place.
Right, exactly.
Outside of Python, what are some of the other languages or communities that you look to for inspiration in your own work and for potential future directions for the language or new capabilities?
I like to think that I'm sort of very in the background learning Rust. I'm a big fan of Rust. I think Rust is a very interesting language. C and C++ have been around forever. I think my own feeling is, I'm very comfortable in C. I've always loved C and Objective-C and C++ and those kind of languages. But I don't think that they're sustainable enough today. And I think Rust can serve the role that C and C++ serves, but in a much more structured and safe way. And I love the fact, for example, that Rust can produce C ABI compatible binaries. So you can build extension modules in Rust and Python doesn't care, right? So that's one particular, and I think for example, like Cargo and the whole dependency management system of Rust is something that we can learn a lot from. Python's dependency management is problematic in some cases, but a lot of that is because Python was the trailblazer, in a lot of ways. And so, we can learn from these newer systems that take a fresh look at some of these problems. So Rust is, I guess, one community and language that I'm following somewhat. I have a pretty diverse set of interests, like totally outside of software engineering and things like that. So finding time for all the things I want to do is really difficult.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know that you are, outside of your accomplishments in the software realm, you are also a somewhat accomplished bass player. So what are some of the other areas outside of programming that you lean on to help maintain your sanity and sort of free yourself from the drudgery of technology?
Yeah. Well, music is the big one. I'm in a couple of bands. I have my own home studio, which I like to do, occasionally come in. For me, playing music and playing bass is like, chicken soup for the soul, right? Like that's what lifts my spirits. And that's been difficult during coronavirus because like all of that public gigs and things like that have just, dried up overnight. So that's been tough, but I'm doing music as much as I can these days. And then the other thing that keeps me sane is I've been practicing Tai Chi for 20 years. And that is a hugely important part of my, especially coronavirus sanity.
Yeah, I can see how that would definitely be beneficial.
Yeah.
And how much of the overall success of Python is due to the invisible hand of the Python secret underground?
Which emphatically does not exist.
Of course.
Yeah, that's funny. That's a really funny one.
Who's responsible for that meme? Because that's been kicking around for quite a long time, I understand.
I think it was me. I'll take the blame for that one, too.
Fair enough. So are there any other aspects of your work in Python or in technology as a whole, or your engagement with the Python community or its impact on your life and career that we didn't discuss that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
No, I think we've covered a lot. I mean, I'm still as big a fan of Python today as I was 25 years ago, and I just encourage, I mentor a couple of people inside LinkedIn, and I really see my role these days, both within Python and as a experienced, senior developer, engineer, in much more of that mentoring and educational role than in just like hacking code, right? And I really want to encourage people, especially young people who look at Python and say, this is a cool language, this is a cool community, and I want to get involved, to please reach out to the steering council, there's a mentorship list. Don't feel like you can't be a core developer. If you love Python, you can be a core developer. Don't feel like you have to be a C programmer to be a core developer. Don't feel like you have to write tons and tons of Python to be a core developer. There's so many opportunities to engage with the community side through the PSF or the technical side. And I just really want to encourage people to think broadly and have faith and confidence in themselves, and that there are people in the more senior positions and the leadership positions who will help you in your journey to shape Python's next 25 years.
And also, if you're considering other communities, how many of them have their own friendly language uncle?
Exactly, right?
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose the series Hannah, which I just watched the second season of. And it's just a really well put together show. Great storyline, really good acting. Highly recommend that for somebody who's looking for something to watch and be distracted for a few hours. And so with that, I'll pass it to you, Barry. Do you have any picks this week?
I have two, actually, that I'm really into these days. One is a show on Netflix called Midnight Gospels, and it hits all my buttons. You know, it's trippy and weird and animated and just bizarre, but underneath all of the weird animation, it just gets into some really deep philosophical topics. So I've been loving that one. I've been savoring those episodes. And the other thing I've absolutely obsessed with these days, I love this show called The Expanse, which I think was on Amazon Prime. And I think the 5th season is coming out at some point, probably next year. But my brother turned me on to the Audible books, you know, the books they're not on tape anymore, but, you know, through Audible, you know, I put them on my phone and I listen to them in the car, and it's just absolutely fantastic. I'm like looking for excuses to drive places now so that I can listen to those books. It's really good.
Yeah, I've been enjoying the Expanse series. I haven't taken the time yet to read or listen to the books, but I'll put that back on my list. So definitely appreciate you taking the time today to join me and share your experiences with the community and with the language. It's always great to talk to you. So thank you again for all of the time and energy that you've put in to help make Python become what it is today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, thank you, Tobias. I've really enjoyed this, as always, and I hope we get a chance to see each other again in person someday soon.
Absolutely.
Well,
all right, take care.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.